Yeah, so the department was created in '79 under the Jimmy Carter
Okay.
kind of presidency. His 4 years. I think Republicans have said for years that they wanted to get rid of the agency, and the they have kind of created this message that the Department of Education's failed because the nation's students are failing. We're not. We're actually doing fairly well. We could do better. I mean, the problem is though is you need to take some of that funding and give it to education.
Yeah.
Pay for more teachers.
Welcome to Student Affairs Now, the online learning community for student affairs educators. I'm your host, Heather Shea. In today's episode, we are diving into the complexities of working in a federal agency and what happens when the political landscape shifts. I'm joined by my friend Jason Cottrell, who has spent the past 9+ years at the U.S. Department of Education, navigating transitions across administrations and shaping policies that impact higher ed. Last month, he was among the 1,300 employees laid off by the department, and today we're going to discuss his journey into federal service, what these layoffs mean for higher ed, and what's next for him and for the larger landscape. Student Affairs Now is a premier podcast and learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to the field of higher education and student affairs. We hope you'll find these conversations make a contribution to the field and are restorative to the profession. We release our regular episodes every week on Wednesdays, and you can find us at studentaffairsnow.com, on YouTube, or anywhere you listen to podcasts. We also have a brand new limited series, Current Campus Context, where we break down the latest news shaping higher ed. Catch new episodes every Friday, wherever you get your podcasts. This episode was sponsored by Evolve. Evolve helps senior leaders release fear, gain courage, and take action for transformational leadership through a personalized cohort-based virtual learning experience. Today's episode is also sponsored by Huron. Huron's educational and research experts help institutions transform their strategy, operations, technology, and culture to foster innovation, financial health, and student success. As I mentioned, I am your host for today's episode, Heather Shea. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am broadcasting from the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples, otherwise known as East Lansing, Michigan, home of Michigan State University, where I work. All right, so let's get into the conversation. I am so excited to introduce my friend, Dr. Jason Cottrell. We have known each other through ACPA. I don't remember exactly. Was it 2010?
About that, I think so. Yeah.
It's been a minute. Anyway, we caught up last month in actually now it's April, in mid-February,
February, right.
just as the chaos in the federal government was starting to unfold. And then we chatted again last month when the news broke that the Department of Education was being gutted. I am so grateful for your service, Jason, and for also your willingness to join this episode.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
yeah, why don't we start with you? Give us a little bit of a fuller introduction, and then what was your role within the Department of Education, and what led you to want to work there? We'll start there.
Sure. So, my name is Jason Cottrell. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am just outside of DC, in Rockville, Maryland. And I worked for the Department of Education for, like you said, 9+ years. It was actually 9 years to the day that I was actually so-called rift. I've been placed on administrative leave until June 9th. So technically I'm getting paid until that point. And so as of today, I am no longer working for the department. And so I have a little bit of leeway to actually talk about a little bit what I've done. The big thing is for the past 8 years, or my first 8 years, I guess, I was the lead research analyst in the Office of Post-Secondary Education, where I worked with the nation's HBCUs, TCCUs, and minority-serving institutions, as well as our FIPSI programs, our TIPSIT programs. And I supported them through what's called the eligibility process. And so I ensured that those MSIs, or HSIs, or ANAPISIs, or Alaska Native Hawaiian institutions, predominantly Black institutions, that they met the requirements to be deemed eligible for the grants that they were seeking in terms of being eligible for those capacity building programs. Uh, I also worked for the on their performance reports and did all of their performance report processing, and did the IT systems for the Office of Post-Secondary Education, and really kind of ensured that those programs met the requirements for cybersecurity, that the APRs were processed in terms of quality data was coming in, and that we were requesting data that wasn't overly burdensome to the institution.
Mm-hmm.
And up until November of last year, that's kind of what I did. That was kind of
Mm-hmm.
the big piece of it. I was promoted in November to data coordinator for the Office of Post-Secondary Education, and at that point, I was responsible for a lot more than just the institutional service grants. And so, I now was taking over responsibility to ensure data quality kind of across
Mm.
OPE, and that the data governance for the Office of Post-Secondary Education was something that we were working towards as part of what's called the Evidence Act. And the Evidence Act was established and or passed in 2018, I believe. And each agency has responsibilities for ensuring that the data that was coming into the agency was of high quality, that we were being, very transparent in terms of the data that we were collecting, and that we were putting that data out on data.gov, which is the kind of platform that's used for all agencies uh, to essentially show these are the data that we're collecting, and this is the data that we have, and if you need it, you can use it and do analyses and those types of things. And so I took that role over in November of 2024, and was super excited, was waiting to kind of get some stuff kind of rolling with the new administration coming in, and really being able to kind of do some great things with the data that post-secondary education really kind of needed. And that was kind of my role up until March. I uh, was excited about being able to serve the public. And that's really the
Mm-hmm.
biggest reason that I went into working for the department. I spent my first 16 years as a professional working on
Mm.
college campuses, doing a lot of great different things, working with our orientation programs at North Carolina Central University, at VCU. I'd worked in financial aid for a number of years, worked in student life at a community college, and worked in learning support, and was
Mm-hmm.
really, a student affairs practitioner at heart. I came back to DC. I grew up in the Shenandoah Valley in rural
Mm.
Virginia, and my parents and my grandparents were all public servants in some capacity, be it
Mm.
as veterans. My grandfather was a member of the Secret Service. He helped install the communication systems at Mount Weather,
Wow.
which is just outside of DC in Virginia. So if there was ever anything that were to happen, that's where the president would go, is to Mount Weather.
Wow.
And that commitment towards public service. And, my parents, my grandparents, they didn't go to college. I, was a first generation college student. And at the same time, there's a history of public service, especially as a Virginian and a UVA graduate. You are committed to being a public servant in this area. And I've always believed that, education is the ultimate public service. That's really
Mm.
something where you can kind of give back. And so when we came back to the DC area, and I was applying for jobs, I was looking at the opportunities. I always joked that I was going to be the Secretary of Education one day, and lo and behold, I get a job at the department, and super excited when I landed the job. It was something that when you grow up in the Northern Virginia, DC, Maryland area, you always kind of learn that, if you ever want a job with stability, supposedly,
Ironically. Yeah. Yeah.
this was the one. And, you work for the federal
Yeah.
government and you would have a job for, as long as you want it.
Hmm.
And, I landed this job because of the alignment that it had with my experience as well as my
Hmm.
education. And,
Hmm.
as I was completing my dissertation in the fall of 2015, I was applying for these jobs here in the DC area. And my dissertation really aligned with, institutional capacity,
Mm.
um, and capacity building.
Yeah.
And so the opportunity presented itself. I accepted the job, and I was super excited every day to get up and go into DC. People always ask what it was like to work for the department, and really working for the government, I always explained it. It's really magical. It's my very first day. I coming out of the metro onto Maryland Avenue at L'Enfant Plaza,
Mm.
and the first thing you see is you come up those escalators and you come out to this blue sky, and there is the U.S. Capitol standing right there in front of you. And there's nothing more magical than seeing the seat of our government right
Yeah.
there. And it's a beautiful sight. And I was excited every day. The pandemic hit. And, I started working on pandemic relief efforts, to provide
Mm.
institutions with funding. We were working, 50, 60 hours a week to get money out the door to institutions because they needed it.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
so when we were working from home, just like everybody else was, to try to get, funding out. I was excited to, be able to go back into the office. Once we were able to. I would go in 1 to 2 days a week, and I started getting off at a different metro stop so that I could walk across the National Mall. And
Ah,
just, there's a
yeah.
sight to be seen. You've got the Washington Monument on one side, the Capitol on the other. You're walking past the museums, and you're seeing the tourists, and they're coming in to see the city. And it really is a great experience. And those are things that to me were reasons that I
Mm.
really wanted to be able to work for the government and transition into a role, in education that I described as being able to impact,
Yeah.
every student in the nation in some way.
Yes.
You really did have an impact on their lives and on the institutions of higher ed. And
Mm.
I chaired the ACPA convention in 2022, and my opening remarks, I described as being able to have the opportunity from Aliskavik, Alaska, all the way down to the Virgin Islands, and from North Carolina Central University to Guam. And you have these opportunities to really just impact so many people's lives and be able to support the education system in our nation. And that was something that I was always excited about. And I cherished every moment. And last Friday when I went to clean out my office, somebody asked me, what do you think? What are you thinking about right now? Is I did 9 years of great work for this nation. And
Mm.
at the end of the
Hmm.
day, I wouldn't change a moment of it.
Yeah.
And, that was what was important and why I transitioned to that role. And that being said, when I first started, I always said, I'll do this for like 10 years and then go back to a college campus. And, here we are 9+ years later. And, I'm now job searching to go back to a
Yeah.
college campus. And,
Yeah.
not on my own accord, because I think I probably would have stuck
Right.
around and
Yeah.
done this for, till retirement. And,
Yeah.
but at the same time, if now is the time for me to move on, it's time for me to move on. So,
Yeah. Well, I love hearing that story and what drew you in because I do think that those of us who don't work in federal agencies or in federal service roles like have this different perspective, right? Because our engagement with the Department of Education is layered.
right.
I'll just
Yeah.
say that. But I am really curious because I do think in the past, however many days, we as a country have been like, well, what do all these federal agencies do? And I would love for you to give us an overview of what the Department of Education does, and maybe more importantly, what it doesn't do, because I think that's part of the narrative, right? And then, tell me a little bit about your day-to-day work.
Sure, sure. The big thing, I'll start with what we don't do.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
don't control curriculum. We don't, or should they don't control
Yeah.
curriculum. They don't really get into what goes on in especially the K-12 system. They don't really
Hmm.
do what most people think they do. And, all that is left up already to the states and to the local, the local entities. What the department was founded on is, and I'll never forget being in my first few months at the department, and it was 2016, early
Mm,
2016, and so we were going into really kind of ramping up election season at that point. And after Hillary lost,
mhm.
I remember kind of the feeling within the department of this transition that's going to happen, and the idea that folks were just reminding us, the Department of Education is a civil rights agency.
Yeah.
And at the end of the
Yep.
day, that's really what the focus is
Hmm.
ensuring that students have an equitable chance at learning and that every student has access to a a high quality education in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And the the department is not responsible for the scores that are coming
Mm,
out.
mm-hmm.
And so when people talk about the nation's report card, the ultimately those report cards are up to the states and your local entities, and
Right.
that is where, folks should be directing their concerns is if, if an if your local school is not succeeding, that's where you need to be focused on making sure that they do. And, that means, increasing funding in or decreasing class sizes, those types of things.
Yeah.
What the Department of Education is responsible for, the largest piece is grant making and
Yeah.
financial aid. And then financial aid is really the biggest,
Yeah.
Pell Grants and,
Yeah.
student loans. All of those things are the number one thing that the Department of Education does. The Title I funding and federal student aid, getting that money out, IDEA after that. And then you start getting into some of the other pieces of the department. And so for me, I I always think of the department as kind of the K-12 side and the post-secondary side. And then
Mm-hmm.
post-secondary is really kind of split into really two big pieces. One of them is being federal student aid, which is where
Mm-hmm.
most of the listeners are going to be familiar with is federal
Yeah.
student aid and making sure that they do that piece well and get the funds to the institution and that students are applying and filling out their FAFSA. The other piece is the Office of Post-Secondary Education, which is where I was. And so for me, OPE is responsible for kind of historically two pieces. One is grant making, and the other is the policy piece that goes into all of the policies that impact institutions and specifically impact federal student aid and accreditation.
Okay.
Those are probably the two that they're most familiar with. For me, I was always kind of on the grant side. That was the biggest piece. I was in the institutional service side. And so, again, those are the HBCUs, the MSIs, the TCCUs, FIPSI, any institution that's received some type of FIPSI grant in the past.
We might need you to
And
say what the acronym of FIPSI is.
FIPSI, sure. It is the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education. And
Okay.
so often, especially if you go back into, the early 2000s,
Mm-hmm.
institutions were receiving a lot of grants for things like computer systems and new computers,
Right.
technology, that type of stuff. The first in the world grant was a FIPSI program. And so Some institutions may have gotten the First in the World grant or heard of it.
Mm.
I was responsible, so I helped create two of those grants in the more recent administration and during the Biden administration. And so I was responsible for the Center of Excellence for Spatial Computing, kind of a unique one there.
Yeah.
They were like, Jason's the data guy. He can do all of the tech stuff.
Spatial
And so,
computing.
yeah, and I was like, I have
Yeah.
no idea what spatial computing was. I do now.
Yeah.
And the second one is the Research and Development Infrastructure Grant. And so,
Oh, okay.
which was a unique one that had come out of the Biden administration's plans. That one was really focused on increasing an institution's capacity to move from, uh, you know, lower level doctoral program in the Carnegie classifications up to Carnegie One if they were a TCCU, an HBCU, or an MSI. And
Gotcha.
so, what most people didn't realize that is the HBCUs knew there were no R1 HBCUs. And the goal was to move several of them up into that. At the same time, Carnegie was also reconfiguring how they classified institutions.
Yeah.
But I think there are two. I think it's North Carolina A&T and
Mm.
Howard are now R1s on the new Carnegie classifications. But we were giving the money out to essentially allow them to go out and improve their capacity to actually do some great things um,
Yeah.
and move into that area. So that's within the FIPSI program. The other things that we also were responsible for in OPE were the International Foreign Language Education area,
Yeah.
EIFL. And so that
Mm-hmm.
is the Fulbright Hayes Scholarship, the Doctoral Dissertation Research Award, where essentially we were giving funds to graduate students to go out and learn how
Mm-hmm.
to, speak certain languages and do their research in those languages, which was, it's a really unique, great program. That program no longer exists. The programs, I guess, do. They've moved them out of the Eiffel area and got rid of the Eiffel folks. And so a lot of those folks were, impacted by the recent layoffs. And we call them RIFs, which is a reduction in force.
Yeah.
You in the federal government, you talk about the force and the mission. Our force was reduced, and so
Mm.
by about half. And so that's really what OPE did is grant
Gotcha.
making. The other area that I forgot to mention that Heather is
Yeah, I
is
know a lot about. Yeah.
I know it's a lot about, which is TRIO and SSS and C
Mm.
Campus and all of the student service level
Mm-hmm.
programs. And so
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about higher education programs within OPE, there's really two areas, student service and institutional service. And the way that I think about it is, the focus of the program. And so the student level or the institutional level
Yeah.
data. And so, institution service, we collect institutional level data, graduation rates, retention rates, those types of things. SS, they collect information related to the student level data. And so
Gotcha.
you're very familiar with that.
Yes. Well,
Um,
I shouldn't say very. I've been in my role over, and one of the programs is Trio. So I learned a lot when I was in DC a couple of weeks ago. But yeah, I had just a very basic knowledge, and now I know a lot more.
yeah, yeah,
So, and there's a
yeah.
lot of concern, right? I mean, and
Mhm.
I think the transition at the top has created a lot of turbulence
Yeah,
across, I mean, but in addition to
right.
all of the people who were let go, I think there's a lot of uncertainty
Mhm.
about what might happen. Um, and when I think about like folks like you, career employees provide the
Yeah,
stability to
yeah.
help weather that storm.
Mhm.
um, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the other two transitions that you
Yeah.
experienced since you came in right at the beginning of Trump one and
Mhm.
then got to see Biden transition. And, how do the career employees deal with that kind of like pendulum swing?
Yeah, yeah. On your very first day when you're a federal employee, of course you come in and you're filling out paperwork and everything, and which you come into the department, you get a what's called a PIV card. It's your ID. You stick it in your computer to start your computer. You tap in to get into the building. It's very much like a debit card to some extent, where it's got the information right there in the card,
Mhm.
and all of those things. And you're sitting there in the morning, everybody's like trying to figure out what's going on. You're filling out retirement paperwork and that type of stuff. And then somebody comes in from human resources and you stand up and, take an oath to the Constitution, and you swear your allegiance to the Constitution, and that you do everything that you can to protect and serve the nation from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And it's very much the same oath that folks in the military take, and or similar oath to the ones that the military takes, and the same one that folks take when they come in as the secretary of an agency. And you it's the if you don't know this, it's kind of weird. So it was a little shocking at first. I was like, wait a minute, what am I doing?
What am I
What do
doing?
you right? I'm like, it's the Department of Education. I didn't think I was taking an oath, and you do. And
Mm,
you understand that whoever is elected, you're going to support their goals and their
mhm.
plans for the agency, and the you're going to follow the laws
Sure.
of the nation. And you know I came in during Obama's end of Obama's term in
Mhm.
2016. And you learn all of these things, and you interact with the political appointees. We call them politicals, the
Mm,
politicals and careers.
okay.
And so you just kind
Yeah.
of learn who they are. And if you're new, you learn all the acronyms, and you spend all your time learning all of these things. And you start to learn their policies and their plans for the agency, for the nation, for the nation's education system. And I remember after the election in 2016, there was a lot of fear as to what was going to happen, because there had been a lot of things being said,
Yeah.
and there was not a lot of experience,
Mhm.
having Trump during his first administration. And you know, you are there to support them.
Mhm.
And you are a career employee who has sworn an oath to the nation and to the Constitution to do what everything for the new administration. And that's
Yeah.
really what the focus was. And so, we worked with a number of political appointees, and got a lot of um, decent folks to come in. And
Yeah.
what I learned, I should say, and I think a lot of folks would agree, is when the Republicans come in, they're very focused on certain things, and they just want you to kind of help them out to get their policies accomplished.
Mhm.
um, when we switched back to Biden, the that administration, the folks were very much, oh no, I just need these things done. And it was all hands on deck to,
Mhm.
get work accomplished. And they were in the weeds on everything, all of the details. And so each administration is a little different, but the Democrats are typically more in the weeds on things, and we're like, get out
Mhm.
of the weeds, just go do what you need to do. We
Yeah.
are worried, we will get these
Yeah.
things done for you.
Yeah.
Republicans, not so much. And I mean, that was the case apparently when Bush came in as well. And so,
Mm.
it's always very different when an administration comes in. And for us, we are there to support the political appointees and do the things
Mhm.
that they are asking us to do. And this go round, you know, I've mentioned to you before, they got rid of the
Yeah.
performance improvement office, which is the strategic planning, area. And I mentioned this to somebody, after I'd received my layoff, is, I can't believe they got rid of the performance improvement area office. That's the one that does strategic planning. And they said, Jason, the plan is to get rid of the agency. That's our final mission. There are no goals outside of getting rid of the agency. And that is what hit me, is that
Mhm.
this administration, it's very they are looking at it from the perspective of no, the agency, we're going to shut down the agency. One way or the other, the Department of Education will be gone. You know, there's that they can't.
Yeah,
But
I
you know
think
what?
I think that's an important detail to get into. We can get into that in a moment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, and well, yeah, like, that those types of things are things that each administration kind of comes in, and
Yeah.
they put in people to come in and have these conversations. There are political appointees over each kind of entity,
Mm-hmm.
and you kind of take their lead, and they're asking you to reword something in a document. And you had asked earlier about our day to day. A lot of
Yeah.
my days are like I'm going through documents and cleaning stuff up and responding to questions from political
Mm-hmm.
appointees. We have what's called the clearance process, and so anytime you see a document that is in the Federal Register, those documents go through two sets of clearance, a third when it gets upstairs to the secretary, and everybody has their hands on it. Anything that I ever developed that went into the Federal Register, that information, and my stuff wasn't even that complicated. It's like a repeat from last year.
Mm-hmm.
The Office for Civil Rights looks at it. The Office of the General
Mm-hmm.
Counsel looks at it. The Office for Elementary and Secondary Education looks at it, and it doesn't even impact them. The Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation, they
Mm-hmm.
look at it. Folks over in IES, the Institute for Education Statistics, they will
Mm-hmm.
look at it just to make sure that it is accurate. And then the political appointees will also take a look at that information to see, what is being said. What are we saying? What do we mean by this? And there are times where literally you will give it to them this year, and then next year they'll change it back to the way that it was because they don't like the way that it's written this year. And it's like
You
it's
just get used
frustrating.
to
You
it.
just get
Yeah.
used to it and you
Yeah.
respond and say, if this is what you want, that's fine. That's the type of stuff that my days were filled with often. Outside of, taking a look at spreadsheets and, analyzing data and, rewriting,
Mm-hmm.
eligibility or performance reports, or, working with grantees when they call, or institutions that aren't grantees, that was the day to day. And each administration comes in and they change their priorities. And so you go through these documents again with a new administration, and that's the stuff that you work with. And you get really great political appointees, and you get some that are not as great, and you still work with them because these are the folks that the president has appointed, or
Mm-hmm.
somebody on the president's team has appointed,
Mm-hmm.
and you work with them as best they can, because at the end
Yeah.
of the day it's about the nation, it's about the nation's students. This is
Yeah.
what the nation has elected, and we're
Exactly.
going to do the best that we can to support the American people.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a fascinating transition. And I imagine that 4 years goes by really fast too,
It,
right? So
it
if
does.
you are the
It does.
person who is elected and is now in charge of this agency, I mean, I think back to like the 2011 Dear Colleague letter from the Office of Civil Rights. It really changed the way that Title IX was to be administered. And that was how many years, into Obama's term.
Right.
So I think, or maybe it wasn't Obama. I don't know. I can't remember all the dates and all of that. But it's just really interesting because I feel like some of these things end up being, yes, it was Obama. Okay.
Mhm.
Now we'll cut that little part out. um, yeah, so I think it's really interesting when you're trying to get something done, you do have to have kind of an understanding of the larger agency.
Mhm.
Um, and it's clear across the board, not just the Department of Education, that this transition is not following any of those historical patterns. So talk with me a little bit about the 1,300 people who were laid off
Yeah.
last month. How, you talked a bit in the beginning about how that impacted you, but you know what is the the immediate and the long-term impacts of all of this change under our current presidential administration?
Yeah, yeah. So, first off, you had mentioned about how quick 4 years goes by,
Yeah.
and I'll never forget when when I first started, um, at the end of Obama's term, somebody was giving a speech and they were introducing Marian Wright Edelman to the department. She was coming in to essentially cheer everybody up, and so they said, when they first started, during Obama's first 4 years, he told them, he's like, listen, we only have 4 years. We're not guaranteed the second 4 years. We only have 4 years. I want you to treat every day like it's the last day of this administration, and we're going to try to get everything done that we can in 4 years done. And so, fast forward to now, they're treating every day like it is the last day, and everything is new, and everything is just being
Yeah.
it's a lot. And we're only on day, what, 80, 90
Yeah.
at this point, and it feels like day, 400 and some. Um, because everything is just it's just being shredded, or the way that we do things is not the way that things are going to be done moving forward. And
Hmm.
clearly that's the goal. And it's not just, with Ed. I mean, it's across the board in all of the agencies. And I think, yesterday it was HHS and they laid off 10,000 people. And,
Hmm.
FDA's right here in Rockville, Maryland, and people didn't know they were literally showing up on April 1st, walking up, and they can't get in the building. Their card's not working. And there's your message. They haven't even logged into their computer.
Wow.
And so it's those
Wow.
types of things that's happening. And so, the 1,300 folks that were laid off, those are at least for the department. So the department isn't that big. It's the smallest cabinet level agency in the
Hmm.
government. And,
Okay.
you're thinking about 2,500 people,
Hmm.
in,
Hmm.
comparison to the Department of Defense, where it's like Department of Defense is massive. There's a reason that the Pentagon is as big as it is. And, historically, we had four buildings. We had gotten it down to three buildings, and we were probably going down to two buildings. Um, it's going to be much smaller. It was
Hmm.
1,300 people that were let go, which is about half of the agency.
Hmm.
And of those, my area, the Office of Post-Secondary Education, we lost, I don't know, 26, I think, folks. Um,
Wow.
from just the layoffs. That's not including, we had a lot of people who took the fork in the road. We had a lot of
Mm.
people who took the Vera, the early retirement option,
Hmm.
and then they laid off the 26 of us. And, when I first started at the department, it was 289 folks. And at the beginning of January, we were at about 140. And so we were already short-staffed.
Hmm.
And now we're, down, probably another 40 some. I wouldn't be surprised if they get down to, less than 100. There's another round coming,
Hmm.
that has already been mentioned. It will come sometime this summer, folks that will also be laid off. And, I mentioned Eiffel was,
Hmm. Hmm.
completely gotten rid of. My area, my promotion took me into the management and support unit.
Mm.
That entire unit got, it was let go.
Had you
But
stayed in your previous role, would you still be working?
I'd still be
Yeah.
working. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
That's
when they say the grass isn't always greener,
yeah. Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
but you don't know.
Yeah.
And the big pieces of the agency that were let go of, though, were some of the critical ones.
Yeah.
FSA got rid of, I think, 600 altogether, federal student aid.
Federal student aid.
You know, IES, the Institute for Education Statistics, was just gutted. The Office of the Chief Data Officer, which is a federally mandated part of the government because of the Evidence Act. That's why it was created.
Mm-hmm.
And they're down to three people.
Wow.
And,
The workload must.
technically,
Yeah.
the wording in the statute is you have to have a chief data officer. Well, they've got a chief data officer, and that's just about it. And they can't be responsible for all of the
Yeah.
data that's coming in and out of the department.
Yeah.
The Office for Civil Rights, they lost all of their staff across the nation, and so that we have folks that are
Regional.
kind of in regions, and
Yeah.
they were all gotten rid of, and that's one of probably the biggest frustration is the Office for Civil Rights, because going
Yeah.
back to what I mentioned earlier, which is the agency is a civil rights entity. I mean, that's
Yeah.
why we were created, was to
Yeah.
ensure, civil rights for our students.
Hmm.
And,
That
they're
might be an
gone.
interesting point to kind of clarify. Like, how old is the department and why was it created? And particularly the civil rights piece, because I knew of this Office of Civil Rights mostly because of my work with Title IX, but I
Yeah.
didn't have this broader understanding of its creation.
Yeah, yeah. So the department was created in 79 under the Jimmy Carter
Okay.
kind of presidency, his 4 years. Everybody, I think Republicans have said for years that they wanted to get rid of the agency, and the they have kind of created this message that the Department of Education's failed because the nation's students are failing. We're not. We're actually doing fairly well. We could do better. I mean, the problem is though is you need to take some of that funding and give it to education.
Yeah.
To pay for more teachers. We, as a department, have existed since 79. The precursor to the department is, we at one point were in what was called health education and welfare, which
Okay.
essentially what they did is they split it up out of HHS and education.
Education.
And so we were known as Hugh. And the irony is there have been folks that I've worked with that were at the department when it was Hugh.
Wow.
They had been with the department for that long.
Wow.
The folks that were in charge of Trio for years. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
I'm not
That
going to mention
predates the
names, but
department.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so it was over in the health, education, and welfare. And so,
Mhm.
they split it up, and with good reason. The department was meant to focus on the civil rights of our nation's students, and that was kind of a big piece of this. And you think back to Brown v. Board,
Mhm.
that was
Mhm.
not that long ago.
Nope.
And the goal of the department was to ensure that students had, equal rights in their education system. And the Office for Civil Rights was designed to essentially protect our nation's students, especially in the K-12 setting where, schools were still segregated.
Segregated. Yeah. Yeah.
And, the nation was at risk of having some extreme issues when it came to civil rights with the students. And so, you know, the Office for Civil Rights would investigate these
Mm.
issues, and they
Mhm.
would go into the schools to find out why were students being treated, differently, across the board.
Mhm.
And, a lot of the today, a lot of the things that they investigated were actually related to students with disabilities and making sure that, students were being treated fairly. I think the message that's getting put out there now is that they were spending a lot of time, trying to investigate, gender and gender identity. And yes, that was a part of it, but
Sure,
it
but
wasn't the 100%. I mean, a lot of what the Office of Civil Rights was doing were, making sure that students were protected to get their IEPs and those types of things. And so,
right.
that's really what the Office for Civil Rights was designed to do within the Department of Education. And when the department was created, it was about getting, even with student loans and Pell Grants, making sure that students were getting access to the things
Access.
that they
Yeah.
needed to, go into post-secondary education, and then
Mhm.
from there to be able to succeed in completing their credentials. And
Mhm.
it's the way that I think about it in a lot of ways is it's almost like an enrollment management perspective of,
Mm,
making sure that students are enrolled, retained, and
mhm,
graduate. And that's a big piece of it. And, when you think of even within post-secondary education, the TRIO programs and SSS programs,
mhm,
that's to get students to learn about college, to get into college, to then stay in
mhm.
college. And then you get into the institutional service side, which is making sure that institutions are having the capacity to do what they need to do to
Yeah.
have those students succeed. The other piece, that I mentioned was the Institute for Education Statistics and iPads, and they're
Oh,
kind of down to bare bones right now, and iPads and IES in general has predated all of us because that goes back to I think 1873 was the first year that the nation started collecting information related to the nation's education systems. And so there's data going back that far, you know, and suddenly we're in 2025 and we have eliminated the majority of the IES staff and the contracts that, collect the data.
yeah. Yeah.
What boggles my mind is they actually got rid of one of the contracts, not related to post-secondary education, but related to K-12. And they got rid of it and didn't realize what the contract did. And suddenly they were like, oh no, we need to bring it back. And so then they're out back to the contractor saying, we need you to come back in and do what you were doing, but we're not going to pay you as much to do this because,
Wow.
and of course, right now they're dangling contracts over people's heads. Of course you're going to do it for the rate that
Yeah.
they want you to pay.
Wow. That's efficiency, I guess. I don't
Right,
know.
right.
I don't even know. I mean, so I let's get into the executive order a little bit
Mhm.
because I do think, first of all, the dramatic signing with
Right.
school children
Thank you. Background.
simultaneously
Yeah,
signing the same thing.
right.
It's still that was such a bizarre it's such a bizarre thing to look at, just
Yeah.
in general. But what does that executive order actually do?
Mhm.
And kind of what is next? And I mean, I think continuing to lay off people, but who actually created the Department of Ed and who gets to keep it going?
Right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, so, the department was created by an act of Congress. It was a law. It was passed by the Senate, it was passed by the House, it was signed by President Jimmy Carter, creating the department. There are pieces of the department that are statutorily required,
Mm-hmm.
collecting data, the Office for Civil Rights, even having an assistant secretary for post-secondary education is in that law.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but again, it gets down to the point of, well, if we have an assistant secretary, is that all that we need? Can we get rid of these things,
Mm-hmm.
move these things around? And so, it's about playing with some of the semantics of the law. The executive order doesn't do much. It directs the secretary to, diminish the department for its closure. Executive orders aren't law, first off. They
Yeah.
are executive orders. They often are orders to the executive branch of the government to do certain things.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't saying, that we're going to override what Congress did and that type of thing. They can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
It is literally just telling somebody in the executive branch this is what you're going to do and this is how you're going to follow it. And the executive order as it stands, it can't do too much. I mean, they can't really close the department. I think the biggest concern right now is the fact that they're talking about moving some stuff around,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the biggest concern. Is you can't really move the student loans over to Small Business Administration easily, if at all. There are things in place.
Mm-hmm.
We can even look back at the Biden administration and we talk about FAFSA.
Yeah.
That was already a major issue. And all
Yeah.
they were doing was they were trying to upgrade the system to make the system better because
Yeah.
it was really old
It was
and
really
it
old. And it was
kind of
collecting a whole bunch of stuff that
it
could be automated. today. Yeah.
Correct, correct. And so
As
there
a
are some
parent who
issues.
filled out FAFSAs both years, I'm very familiar the change.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That was already a big
Yeah.
hiccup for college
Yeah.
campuses.
Yeah.
And so, you think now, now you're just going to move the entire portfolio of student loans over to another agency. The one thing that stands out in my mind is, if you're talking about moving the student loan system over to Small Business Administration and IES, all of the education statistics over to, let's say, Commerce, because they collect data on, the census. Uh, you're going to run into issues, a lot of them. The first
Mhm.
being, the college scorecard, and I'm assuming most folks are familiar with the college scorecard. You can go on and you can
We'll
look up the
send a link.
colleges.
We'll put a link in the chat if it still
Yeah.
exists.
That one, there are folks that work on that. I have, I know that some of those folks are still there, and luckily the college scorecard is going to continue to exist. Um, that has data that is linked to student records in terms of the IRS. And so once you graduate, that
Mm,
information comes from IRS over to the department so that we can take a look and say, this is the average salary of a graduate at this institution. And it was it was a big deal when that happened because of the fact that now the IRS data is going to the Department of Education. And so we had to have a memorandum of understanding
sure,
that we could
sure.
access this data. And the same thing with FAFSA data, when you pull that information over from the IRS to your FAFSA data, is that
Yeah,
making sure that that's all legit.
yeah,
And the same thing with your student loans when you're, re-upping your, income dependent, repayment plan. Is that legit, and making sure that that's coming over properly? And you get a little letter in the mail that says, this was accessed. The memorandum of understanding took years to get cleared through the Department of Justice, through the courts, through all of those things. The same thing is going to happen now because those programs that I talked about that I worked on rely on iPad's data. And the
mm,
iPad's data has to be accessible to the
hmm,
department. And so if you're just going to throw them over to the Commerce Department, but then you're going to move the grants over to HHS, suddenly there's an issue where I can't just access those data
yeah,
anymore. That has to be communicated in some way. And so it's not as easy as just signing an executive order. There has to be a plan. You can't just come downstairs and do a press conference and saying we're going to do it.
hmm,
There
yeah,
are a lot of pieces of the puzzle that make it impossible to do in 4 years.
yeah,
It's going to be a 10-year process. You can pass the legislation now, but it's going to take time to get that to the point where it needs to be. And so,
yeah,
I don't expect the Department of Education to close in the next 3.5 years now. If
hmm,
we're counting down. And so those pieces are, it's going to take a while. And so
yeah,
I don't think anybody needs to be fearful of that. I think what they need to be fearful of is, people disappearing at the department that do the things that need to be done to ensure that
yeah,
funding is going to the right places and to
yeah.
the right people.
Yeah. I mean, I know from the Trio Policy Summit where we were, in DC, the big question was we have a couple of different grant competitions that are either in process or coming. And, I know on my campus, I have 600 students who are served by our Trio grant. And we're waiting to know. Like, and if we don't know by August, that's completely changing the way those 600 students are
Yeah,
potentially to be served or not. And I think the delay might be harder than just saying you didn't get the grant, I mean,
right,
because we're in this limbo state. Of course, like fulfilling those promises is what Congress has created.
right.
The appropriation was
Hmm.
appropriated by Congress, which is why we were in
Yeah,
DC talking with our representatives. So,
yeah. Yeah, yeah, and that's the conversation that we've been having a lot with folks is
mhm,
um, at least until I was there, I guess.
Yeah.
My last day was actually March 6th. I had surgery on March 7th, and so I was out on leave, and then so I really haven't talked to anybody. But the up until that date, people were asking, when are these competitions coming? And
Yeah.
so, when you're thinking about the MSI programs,
Yeah.
and that's the best example I can give is there's a process that kind of has to happen in a timeline, and
Yeah.
whenever we're thinking about the like current grants, we're really thinking about the 2 years from now because we start to work
Yeah.
backwards in a
Yeah.
lot of ways. And so, you know, we start with September 30th. That's the
Yeah.
date. And so
Yeah.
the reason that we use that is that's the last day of the federal fiscal year. And that's the last day that we can obligate funds for a program. And so September 30th is that drop dead date for everything.
Mm-hmm.
Then you move backwards. And so as of today, it is, April 2nd, and we still have eligibility for the MSI programs open. So we can't even start competitions really.
Mm.
They are taking forever to clear the NIAs, which is the notice inviting applications for programs. We can't do fund down the slates because they didn't let us open the annual performance reports for the grants because they have issues with certain things, and so suddenly, we're halfway through the fiscal year and we haven't started competitions. Now you've also cut the folks who run the competitions. um, you know, it was never my job to really run most competitions outside of the FIPSI
Mm-hmm.
programs that I mentioned earlier,
Mm-hmm.
but I helped out. I was a panel
Yeah.
monitor, I was a control room person, and so the competitions typically, you know, a reviewer will get 10 to 15 applications to review, and you do them in panels of 2 to 3. Typically, three's better because there's a
Yeah.
tiebreaker there.
Yeah.
Um, and, with Trio, for example, you get thousands of applications in.
Yeah.
Who's
Yeah.
reviewing them? Who is panel monitoring to make sure that things are being done in a way
Mm-hmm.
that is appropriate to ensure that there is no waste, fraud, or abuse in the
Right.
process? And
Right.
so that's where
Yeah.
that is.
Yeah. And I know that we were told that the review had already happened. Now they're just on the like, okay, we need to get the
Yeah.
notification out.
Yeah.
So well, let's I'd love to hear a little bit about what's next for you. How are you now transitioning back into higher ed, and how are you using your experience to kind of leverage your
Right.
skill set, right? I
Right.
mean, I think that this is the benefit of having seen both sides. You have this like insider knowledge.
Yeah, yeah. So I am on the job search. If you know anything, I'm looking from
In
like
Maryland.
Baltimore, in Maryland,
Yeah.
DC, Virginia.
Yeah.
I'm really kind of looking anywhere from like north of Baltimore down to Northern Virginia, Springfield area, and then I'd say Annapolis because I don't want to cross the bridge all the way out towards Frederick, maybe Hagerstown. Um, and
For people
so
who are in that area,
right,
if you
if you're
have
looking.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm applying there. I'm kind of lucky because I'm in the first round of all of this.
Hmm.
And B, it is the spring, which it's higher ed hiring season, I think, in a
Yep.
lot of ways.
Yep.
The biggest concern I think right now is, you know, I'm getting contacts from federal contractors. Well, federal contractors, we don't know if their contracts are going to be renewed or
Yeah.
picked up, or, it's kind of a wonky time. Colleges and universities are kind of putting hiring freezes on and maybe some layoffs because, if they're in the
Yeah.
scientific area, they're losing funding in NIH. But I'm extremely open to a lot of different things right now. I I would like to return to a campus, I think,
Hmm.
is kind of where I'm leaning. But I'm applying for, some nonprofits that are hiring. I think some entities are kind of ramping up because they know that they're getting ready to take on an administration for the next
Yeah.
4 years. And so they need folks, especially in the policy and research realm. And so I
Yeah.
do, my background is in student affairs. I'd love to go back to student affairs. I should say student affairs and enrollment management.
Hmm.
I was
Hmm.
in orientation, worked in enrollment
Mm-hmm.
management, but that's also that overlapping area.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I'm excited to see what the kind of the future is going to bring for me. It's kind of a new day. The hardest part is, for the first few days, I was very sad to be losing my job because it was something I really did love. But I think that there are ways that I can assist students, outside, and the ways that I can support the public, outside of the Department of Education. And, it's a little bit of a new day, I think, for all of us. I think all of us, from college campuses to nonprofits to government workers, we have to really rethink about the way that we're approaching this work.
Yeah.
And I have 100% belief that my colleagues within the department that are remaining, that they're going to do what's right for our nation's
Yeah.
students, and they're going to
Yeah.
do, they're going to do the best that they can with the people that they've got. They're going to try to make that September 30th deadline, whether or not
Yeah.
I'm there or not. And so, I want people to know that there are people there that are still working to try to get these things done. For me, it's just a question of, where I'm going to go. And, I do want to stay in the area. I love living here. I grew up in this area. There's something magical about DC and this
Yeah.
region. I love my crab cakes here in Maryland. ACPA is coming up in Baltimore next year.
Oh, it's gonna be great.
Shout
It's
out,
gonna be great. Yeah.
great opportunity for folks to come out to Baltimore. I don't know. I don't know what's
Yeah.
next for me. I really am kind of looking in a broad swath of things. Everything from associate dean all the way up to vice president is kind of where I'm
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of
Mm-hmm.
looking. And
Yeah.
I'm excited about the opportunities. It's the hardest part is getting back into how do I write these cover letters for for these types of
For these types
jobs,
of positions.
right?
Yeah.
And how do
Yeah.
I clean that stuff up? But in
Yeah.
the meantime, I'm trying to really focus on me. People have asked how I'm doing. I'm at peace with all of this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I internally, like, I thought that I'd be really scared, upset, all that stuff. I'm at
Mm-hmm.
peace with it.
Mm-hmm.
I've really kind of been focusing on me. Baseball season starting, so I'm hitting some baseball games.
Mm-hmm.
Hockey season's coming to an end. My Caps are doing really well, so Ovi's getting ready to cross over and pass Gretzky. So it's those types of things that I have been
Yeah.
focused on. My dogs, being here, being back at home with them, because I'm no
Mm-hmm.
longer in the office.
Mm-hmm.
And my husband, he's here, working from home. And so, it's about that type of stuff.
Yeah.
I'm really kind
Yeah.
of trying to reconnect to my own roots. I'm trying to,
Who are you? Yeah.
I get some writing done. I've
Mm-hmm.
had like ideas for books that I haven't been able to legally, ethically write. And
Right.
now I can actually start writing. I've got at least two books that I couldn't. One is a fictional book, but two of them I have not been able to write. And so now I can actually focus on developing those proposals, and get some creativity out. My husband's the artist in the family. I am
Mm-hmm.
not.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, one of the things I really want to do is focus on some of the crafting and that type of stuff. My sister and I are both crafters more than anything. And
That's
so
great.
it's that
That's what's bringing you joy,
it
right?
is. It is.
And
And, it's springtime. It's
yeah.
fresh
Yeah.
season. It is spring. So,
Yeah.
yes.
Well, we always end our episodes with the same question. Our podcast is called Student Affairs Now. What are you thinking about, troubling, pondering now?
If fresh season,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I know folks are scared.
Mm-hmm.
And rightfully so. I think, especially when it comes to DEI work on college
Yeah.
campuses, especially in student affairs. Um, and it's going to be hard. And I want folks to know that, one of the things that has brought me kind of to this point of peace is I know that there are college administrators out there, student affairs practitioners that are doing the work to ensure that the student who loses a parent there's somebody there to listen.
Mm-hmm.
That if a student is dealing with an issue related to their sexual orientation or gender identity, that there is somebody on their college campus that is there to listen and support them and help them out. And so that in terms of things that I'm kind of pondering is it's that there are folks there that are able to help, and they may not be able to have the public facing website or the DEI program, whatever it may
Mm-hmm.
be. There are folks on that campus that are they are going to make sure that they can help those students succeed
Yeah.
and be safe and unharmed. Regardless of what you call it, they are they may not be in the identity center,
Mm-hmm.
but they are there, and that they are going to do whatever they need to make sure that the word gets out. I mean, that has been what folks have been doing for 100 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's when gay men and women were in
Yep.
college in the 70s and 80s, there was
Mm-hmm.
somebody there, even if there wasn't an LGBT resource center. And so
Yep.
just know that is the case, and trust and believe in hope and joy. And just, we will all get through this together. It's going to be rough, but there are people that we can all talk to, and come together in community, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
go to a conference, go to a regional conference, go to those institutes, set up these calls is the other
Yeah.
thing,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, go back to the days when during COVID, where we were doing, virtual happy hours. If you
Yeah.
need to do that with your friends. That's what it's about. And just, I think a lot of people, like I said, I think a lot of people are scared. But the things that I've been really trying to think about is, that there are people there, and we haven't disappeared. You know,
Right. Right.
we're
Yeah.
here. You
Yeah.
know, we're here for one another, and we're here for our students.
That's great. Well, Jason, thank you so much. It was great to talk to you. I feel like I learned so much about the Department of Ed, and I, you know, feel like on the front end, I was like, oh, I kind of know all these things, and we've been creating FAQs for students and stuff, and I'm like, this is fascinating. So thank you for your time. We also want to take a moment to express our gratitude to Nat Ambrosi, our producer. Nat, we so appreciate all the work that you do to make us look and sound great. And thanks again to our sponsors for today's episode, Huron and Evolve. Evolve helps senior leaders who value, aspire to lead on, and want to unleash their potential for transforming leadership. Our own, my good friend Keith Edwards, along with doctors Brian Arau and Don Lee, offer personalized experience with high impact value. The asynchronous content in 6 individual and 6 group coaching sessions maximize your learning and growth with a focused time investment, greatly enhancing your ability to lead powerfully for social change. Huron collaborates with colleges and universities to create sound strategies, optimize operations, and accelerate digital transformation. By embracing diverse perspectives, encouraging new ideas, and challenging the status quo, Huron promotes institutional resilience in higher education. For more information, please visit go.hcg.com/now. To all of our listeners, if you're tuning in today and you're not already subscribed to our weekly newsletter, please take a moment to enter your email in the very bottom header of our website on studentaffairsnow.com. Stay in the loop with the latest episodes delivered to your inbox each week on Wednesdays. And I am, as I said at the beginning, Heather Shea. Thanks to everybody who is watching or listening. Let's make it a great week.